The house shimmered with a kind of warmth only Christmas could conjure. Soft golden light spilling from every lamp, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon and roasting turkey. The kitchen was my sanctuary, a place where I'd spent decades, kneading dough, stirring gravy, and humming old carols as I worked. Each dish on the table was a piece of my heart. My mother's cranberry sauce, my late husband's favorite stuffing, pies I'd baked since my children were small. I wanted everything to be perfect, not for praise, but because feeding the people I loved was the truest language I knew. From the dining room, laughter floated in, mingling with the clatter of silverware and the faint sound of Bing Crosby on the radio. My son's voice, deep and reassuring, called out, "Mom, smells amazing in here." My heart fluttered at the compliment, even as a familiar anxiety tugged at me. I wiped my hands on my apron, checked the oven one last time, and carried the turkey to the table, careful not to spill the juices. My daughter-in-law, Claire, was already seated, her posture perfect, her phone in hand as she snapped photos of the spread. I caught her eye and smiled, hoping for a moment of connection. "Let me tell you the whole story. But first, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. It will help me a lot. And also comment below, from where you are listening to me. I want to know to where my voice is reaching." So, as everyone gathered, I took my usual place at the end of the table. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe this would be a Christmas, like the ones I remembered, full of warmth, laughter, and gratitude. Plates were passed, glasses filled, and the room buzzed with conversation. I watched my grandchildren giggle over the snowman-shaped rolls. My son carved the turkey with practiced hands. I felt for a fleeting second like I belonged. Then, as I set a dish of sweet potatoes in front of Claire, she wrinkled her nose and leaned toward her husband, her voice just loud enough to carry. "This is why we always eat out, you know? Mom's food is so old-fashioned." The words landed in the center of the table like a dropped glass. The laughter died instantly. My son shifted in his seat, embarrassed. My grandchildren looked down at their plates. I felt every pair of eyes flicker to me, waiting to see how I'd react. I forced a smile, my cheeks burning. "Well, I suppose some traditions never go out of style," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound light. Inside, humiliation flared, hot, sharp, and familiar. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached for the gravy boat, willing myself not to spill. I wanted to disappear, to shrink so small I'd slip between the floorboards and never be seen again. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, before someone changed the subject, but the damage was done. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I watched Claire laugh and swipe through her phone, oblivious to the sting of her words. I remembered every Christmas I'd spent making magic for this family, staying up late to wrap gifts, rising early to bake cinnamon rolls, putting everyone's happiness before my own. Now, in my own home, at my own table, I felt like a relic, a punchline, a burden. As the meal went on, I moved through the motions, passing dishes, refilling glasses, nodding at stories I'd heard 100 times before. My hands worked with the practiced ease of decades, but inside something was unraveling. I watched my family, my son's easy laughter, my grandchildren's eager chatter, Claire's effortless confidence, and felt the familiar ache of being on the outside, looking in. I realized with a quiet sadness that I was no longer seen for who I was, only for what I could provide. I was the hands that baked, the arms that carried, the smile that smoothed over awkward silences. The laughter echoed around my table, but it wasn't for me. It passed through me, as if I were made of air, in that moment something shifted. I looked at the faces I loved most in the world and saw, not malice, but a kind of blindness, a failure to notice the woman behind the apron. I felt the sting of it, sharp and cold. I promised myself this would be the last time I let anyone make me feel small in my own home. The last time I would swallow my pride and call it grace. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I was done being invisible. When the last echoes of laughter faded and the front door closed behind my family, the house seemed to exhale, releasing all the warmth and noise in a single hollow breath. The rooms that had pulsed with life only minutes before now felt cavernous and empty. I stood in the kitchen doorway, hands resting on the edge of the counter, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the relentless ticking of the clock above the stove. The table in the dining room was a battlefield. Half-eaten food, abandoned plates, crumpled napkins and wine glasses smeared with fingerprints. The remnants of a celebration that had left me feeling anything but festive. I moved slowly, gathering plates and glasses, scraping leftovers into the bin. The scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey, so comforting just hours before, now clung to the air like a bittersweet memory I couldn't shake. I stacked the plates, careful not to let them clatter too loudly, as if the noise might shatter the fragile composure I was clinging to. My hands moved on autopilot, but my mind was far away, drifting back to Christmases long gone. I remembered the first Christmas I spent in this house, the walls still smelling of fresh paint, my children so small they could barely reach the table. My late husband, George, had insisted on stringing up every light he could find, turning our little home into a beacon of holiday cheer. He'd sit at the head of the table carving the turkey with a flourish, always making a show of praising my cooking. "Best turkey in the neighborhood," he'd say, winking at the kids, who would giggle and ask for seconds. The house had been filled with warmth then, not just from the oven, but from the love that seemed to seep from the very walls. Every corner glowed with the promise of laughter and togetherness, and I felt like the heart of it all. Now, as I scraped congealed gravy from a serving dish, the silence pressed in on me. The laughter that had once filled these rooms was gone, replaced by the echo of Claire's words. "Your food is so old-fashioned." The phrase looped in my mind, each repetition another tiny cut. I replayed the moment over and over, searching for some way I could have responded differently, some clever retort that would have preserved my dignity. But I'd only managed a weak smile, my voice trembling with the effort to sound unaffected. The humiliation clung to me, heavier than any winter coat, wrapping around my shoulders and settling deep in my bones. I rinsed the dishes, the water running hot over my hands, and tried to shake off the sting of her words. But it lingered, a shadow in every corner of the kitchen. I thought of all the hours I'd spent preparing for this day, poring over recipes, kneading dough, chopping vegetables until my hands ached. I'd wanted so badly for everything to be perfect, to create a memory my family would cherish, a tradition they would carry forward. Instead, I felt like a ghost haunting my own kitchen, unseen and unappreciated, my love and effort dismissed as relics of a time no one cared to remember. I paused, hands resting on the edge of the sink, and let my gaze wander over the quiet chaos of the room, the flickering candle stubs, the empty serving platters, the crumbs scattered across the tablecloth, all signs of a feast, but none of celebration. I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, the accumulation of small hurts and unspoken disappointments. My reflection in the window looked tired, the lines on my face etched deeper by the night's events. For a long moment I stood there, letting the silence settle. Then with a slow, steady breath, I began to clear away the last of the dishes. Each plate I washed, each glass I dried, felt like a small act of reclaiming, of reminding myself that I was more than what others saw, more than the sum of their passing judgments. I was Ruth. I was a mother, a wife, a friend, and a woman who had built a life out of flour and love, and I was done being invisible. As I wiped down the counters, the rhythmic motion of the cloth couldn't scrub away the heaviness in my chest. The kitchen, once a place of laughter and busy hands, now felt like a stage after the curtain had fallen, empty, echoing, haunted by the ghosts of happier times. I caught sight of my reflection in the window, ghostly and pale in the glass. The woman staring back at me looked so tired. Her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of disappointment and years of unspoken hurt. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, feeling the chill seep through my skin, grounding me in the present even as my mind wandered through the past. I wondered when I had become invisible, when the woman who once filled this home with warmth and celebration had become someone whose efforts were overlooked, whose love was simply expected, no longer cherished. When had my food become old-fashioned, my stories something to be tolerated rather than savored? The realization stung, sharp and cold, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Was it gradual, this fading into the background? Or had it happened all at once, in the space between one Christmas and the next? My thoughts drifted to George. I could almost see his easy smile, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he teased me, the gentle squeeze of his hand on mine when the world felt overwhelming. He'd never let a harsh word go unchallenged, never allowed anyone to diminish me in my own home. I missed him fiercely in that moment, longing for his steady presence, his unwavering support. What would he say if he could see me now, standing alone in a kitchen that had once been the heart of our family? Would he be proud, or would he ache for me as I ached for him? The clock chimed 9, its sound startling in the hush of the house. The heat had slipped away with the last of the day's sunlight, leaving the rooms colder, the air tinged with the scent of pine and cooling embers. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering, as I made my way to the living room, each step echoing. On the hardwood floor, the Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, its ornaments catching the lamplight, casting tiny rainbows on the walls. Beneath it, the gifts had all been opened, the paper and ribbons discarded in a cheerful, careless heap, a stark contrast to the emptiness I felt inside. I sank into the armchair by the window, pulling a faded quilt over my knees, the fabric soft and familiar against my skin. I closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me like a gentle tide. I saw my children as they once were, faces sticky with frosting, eyes wide with wonder as they tore into their presents, their laughter ringing out like bells. I felt the weight of their small bodies as they clambered into my lap for a bedtime story, the warmth of their trust and love filling me with a sense of purpose I'd never found anywhere else. I remembered the joy I'd found in those simple moments, the way my heart had soared with every smile, every hug, every whispered, "I love you, Mummy." But now, that joy felt distant, unreachable, a star I could see but never touch. I wondered if I had failed somehow, if my love had been too much, too smothering, too old-fashioned, just like my cooking. I wondered if the world had moved on without me, leaving me behind in a house full of memories no one else seemed to value. The ache of loneliness pressed in on me, heavy and relentless. Suddenly the phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the silence. I hesitated, staring at the receiver, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to let it ring, to retreat further into my solitude. But another part, a small, stubborn spark, longed for connection, for a voice that might remind me I still mattered. I picked up the receiver, pressing it to my ear. "Hello." "Hey, Ruth, it's Mabel," came the familiar, comforting voice on the other end. "I just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas. I hope you saved me a slice of that famous apple pie of yours." A genuine smile broke across my face, the first I'd managed all evening. Mabel had been my neighbor for 30 years, a constant presence through every joy and sorrow. She'd lost her husband the same year I lost George, and we'd leaned on each other ever since, two old souls weathering life's storms together. "Oh, Mabel, I made 2 pies this year. You know I always save you a slice," I replied, my voice lighter already. She laughed, a warm crackling sound that filled the emptiness in my living room. "You always made the best pie, Ruth. I swear if I could bottle that smell, I'd never be lonely again." Her words wrapped around me like a hug, soothing the ache in my chest. For a moment I let myself believe her, that my effort still had value, that the love I poured into my cooking could still bring someone comfort. We talked for a while, reminiscing about old Christmases, sharing stories of our grandchildren, our voices growing softer as the night wore on. With every word, the weight on my shoulders eased, replaced by the gentle warmth of friendship and shared memory. When I finally hung up, the house didn't feel quite so cold. I looked around at the remnants of the day, the empty plates, the crumpled napkins, the half-finished pie on the counter, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't as invisible as I thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for me in this world, and still a reason to keep loving, keep baking, keep believing in the power of a simple homemade pie. When I finally hung up, the house didn't feel quite so cold. Mabel's laughter lingered in the air, a gentle warmth that softened the edges of my loneliness. I looked around at the remnants of the day. The empty plates stacked haphazardly by the sink, the crumpled napkins tossed aside, the half-finished pie waiting patiently on the counter. In the quiet, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't as invisible as I thought. Maybe, somewhere beneath the layers of hurt and humiliation, there was still a part of me that could find joy in the simple act of feeding the people I loved. I stood, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, and wandered. Back to the kitchen! The overhead light cast a golden glow on the worn countertops, illuminating the pie's glossy surface. I cut a generous slice, the knife sliding through the tender crust, with a satisfying sigh. I placed the piece on a plate, grabbed a fork, and carried it to the table. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I sat, fork in hand, and took a bite. The flavors, sweet apples, warm spices, flaky crust, tasted like memory, like comfort, like home. Each mouthful was a reminder of who I was and what I had given, not just tonight, but over a lifetime. I let myself grieve the Christmas I had hoped for, the family I missed, the love that sometimes felt unreturned. Tears pricked my eyes, but I didn't turn away from the ache. I let it wash over me, cleansing and honest. But as I ate, I also let myself remember the woman I had been, the mother who stayed up late to finish birthday cakes, the wife who made Sunday roasts from scratch, the friend who delivered casseroles to neighbors in need. I wasn't ready to give up on her just yet. There was strength in those memories, a quiet resilience that had carried me through harder times than this. The night deepened, the house settling around me, each creak and sigh a reminder that I was still here, still standing. I finished my pie, washed the plate with deliberate care, and turned off the kitchen light. As I climbed the stairs to bed, I carried with me the warmth of Mabel's words, the memory of laughter, and a quiet resolve growing in my heart. I might have been dismissed tonight, But I would not let myself be erased. Not yet. The days after, Christmas drifted by in a haze of gray skies and silence. I moved through the house in slow motion, packing away ornaments with trembling hands, sweeping up pine needles from the rug. Each task felt heavier than the last, my mind replaying Claire's words every time I passed the kitchen. Each time I opened the fridge and saw the untouched leftovers, I felt the sting all over again. My hands, once so sure and confident in the kitchen, hesitated now, hovering uncertainly over pots and pans, as if the act of cooking itself had become a question I was suddenly afraid to answer. But life has a way of nudging us forward, even when we'd rather hide. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, I unfolded the local paper, more out of habit than interest. My eyes drifted over the headlines. Politics, weather, a new library opening. Until something caught my attention. Top 10 must-try restaurants. This winter, the headline announced in bold, festive print. Curiosity stirred. I scanned the list. There, at number 3, was Claire's favorite. Bistro Nouveau, modern twists on classic cuisine. I stared at the glossy photo of the restaurant's sleek dining room, the artful plates arranged like paintings. Each dish, a tiny masterpiece. Beneath the image, a quote jumped out at me. The perfect place for families who crave sophistication. I could almost hear Claire's voice, see her arching an eyebrow as she scrolled through reviews on her phone, her tone half mocking, half admiring. I remembered the way she'd spoken about Bistro Nouveau at the Christmas table, her words laced with pride and a subtle challenge, her unspoken way of saying, "This is what real food looks like." A strange mix of emotions welled up inside me. Resentment, curiosity, and something sharper, more defiant. I found myself wondering what all the fuss was about. What was it about this place that made her so eager to compare, so quick to dismiss what I had to offer? Was it truly better, or was it just different, newer, shinier, more fashionable? Setting my mug aside, I leaned forward, tracing the photo with my fingertip. The restaurant looked beautiful, yes, but it also looked impersonal. Pristine white tablecloths, minimalist decor. Not a speck of flour or a smudge of jam in sight. I wondered if anyone there would remember a customer's favorite pie, or if the chef would ever call out from the kitchen just to say hello. A thought began to form, a gentle stirring of curiosity, tinged with the beginnings of resolve. Maybe it was time to see for myself what made Bistro Nouveau so special. Maybe it was time to step out of the shadows of my own kitchen and into the world, to taste what others celebrated, and perhaps to remember that I, too, had something worth celebrating. I folded the paper, my heart beating a little faster. The sting of Christmas was still there, but now it was joined by a spark of something new. I wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in days, I felt the faintest glimmer of anticipation. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something I hadn't dared to imagine, a chance to reclaim my place at the table, not just for my family, but for myself. A strange feeling bubbled up inside me, not quite anger, not quite sadness. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something sharper, something that felt a little like defiance. For so long, I'd accepted my place in the background. But now, with Claire's words still echoing in my mind, and the glossy restaurant photo staring up at me from the newspaper, I felt something shift. Before I'd even finished my coffee, I found myself reaching for my coat and keys, the familiar weight of my old wool coat settling over my shoulders like a shield. The winter air was brisk as I drove across town, the city still dusted with the remnants of last week's snow. The world outside my window was quiet. Bare trees etched against a pale sky, sidewalks lined with icy patches, the occasional bundled-up pedestrian hurrying along. My breath fogged the windshield as I parked in front of Bistro Nouveau, its glass windows gleaming in the pale morning light. The restaurant looked exactly as I'd imagined. Minimalist decor, black and white photos on the walls, a single vase of white lilies on each table. It was elegant, yes, but also impersonal. More like a magazine spread than a place where memories were made. I hesitated at the door, suddenly self-conscious in my old coat and sensible shoes. I could almost hear Claire's voice in my head, appraising, critical, always just a little bit amused. For a moment I considered turning back, but then I squared my shoulders and stepped inside, determined not to let insecurity win. A hostess in a crisp black uniform greeted me with a practiced smile. "Table for one?" she asked, her eyes flicking over me with polite indifference, as if she'd already decided I didn't quite fit the aesthetic. "Yes, please," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. She led me to a small table by the window, handed me a menu, and disappeared with the efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. I glanced around. The restaurant was nearly empty. Just a young couple whispering over coffee in the corner and a businessman, hunched over his laptop, his face lit by the blue glow of the screen. The silence was stark, broken only by the faint clink of silverware from the kitchen and the low hum of an espresso machine. I studied the menu, searching for the dish Claire had raved about at Christmas. There it was. Heritage chicken with rosemary juice and truffle mash. The description was elaborate, promising layers of flavor and culinary artistry. I ordered it, along with a cup of tea, and sat back to wait, my hands folded in my lap, trying to quiet the flutter of nerves in my stomach. As I waited, I watched the owner behind the bar. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped as he counted receipts, a frown etched deep between his brows. Every so often he glanced at the door, as if hoping for a rush of customers that never came. There was a weariness about him, a quiet resignation that spoke of long hours and dreams slowly fading. I noticed, too, the "For Sale" sign taped discreetly near the hostess stand, half hidden behind a stack of takeout menus, as if he was embarrassed by its presence, as if admitting defeat was something to be ashamed of. When my food arrived, I studied it with a critical eye. The chicken was artfully arranged, the jus drizzled in a perfect circle, the potatoes piped into a neat mound. It was beautiful, no doubt, but as I took my first bite, I realized something was missing. The flavors were good, subtle, refined, each ingredient carefully balanced, but it was missing the warmth I remembered from Sunday dinners and holiday feasts. It was technically perfect, but it didn't taste like home. It didn't taste like love. A wave of sadness washed over me. But this time, it didn't settle. Instead, it sparked something else. A memory of George, sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of bills and a yellow legal pad. Ruth. He'd say, "Never be afraid to invest in yourself. The best things we ever did started with a leap of faith." He'd taught me to read the fine print, to ask questions, to trust my instincts, even when the world tried to make me doubt. I glanced, again at the owner, his weary face, the empty tables. A thought took root, tentative at first, then growing stronger with every heartbeat. What if I could do something with this place? What if, instead of shrinking away, I could take this insult and turn it into something new, something that belonged to me? The idea was wild, almost laughable, but it refused to let go. After paying my bill, I lingered by the bar as the owner wiped down glasses. his movements slow and deliberate. The restaurant was even quieter now, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. I cleared my throat, suddenly nervous, but determined. "Excuse me," I said, my voice gentle. "I noticed your sign by the door. Are you selling the restaurant?" He looked up, surprised, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice. For a moment our eyes met, his, tired and searching. Mine, uncertain, but quietly hopeful. The silence stretched between us filled with possibility. "Yes," he said finally, his voice soft. "Yes, I am. Are you interested?" And in that moment, with the scent of rosemary and truffle still lingering on my tongue, I realized I was. I truly was. He looked up, surprised. "Yes, actually. It's been a tough year. Not enough business to keep the doors open. Are you interested?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. I might be. I've spent most of my life in kitchens, cooking for family, friends, neighbors. I know what it means to make a meal that brings people together. He smiled a little sadly. "That's what I wanted this place to be. But maybe it needs a new vision, someone who understands comfort food, not just fancy plating." We talked for a while, his story unfolding, in bits and pieces. The rising rent, the struggle to attract regulars, the pressure to keep up with trends. I listened, nodding, my mind already racing with ideas. I thought of my mother's recipes, of the pies that made Mabel call me every Christmas, of the laughter that once filled my own dining room. When I left Bistro Nouveau, the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked to my car, the cold air biting at my cheeks. But I felt a warmth blooming inside me, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I could almost hear George's voice, urging me on. "Take the leap, Ruth. You've got more to give than you know." That night I sat at my kitchen table, a pad of paper and a pen in front of me. I made a list. What I'd need to learn, who I'd need to call, what it would take to turn that sterile restaurant into a place that felt like home. I thought about the family recipes tucked away in my old recipe box, the stories behind each dish, the memories baked into every bite. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something other than hurt. I felt determined. I would not let Claire's words be the last thing that defined me. If my food was old-fashioned, then maybe the world needed a little more of that. Maybe what people craved wasn't sophistication, but sincerity. A place where they could sit down, take a breath, and feel like they belonged. I picked up the phone and dialed the number the owner had given me. My voice was steady, my heart racing with anticipation. "Hi, it's Ruth. I'd like to talk more about the restaurant." As I hung up, I looked around my quiet kitchen, the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not by my family, not by strangers, but by myself. The spark of defiance had become a flame, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The next morning dawned cold and bright, sunlight glinting off the frost that rimmed my window panes. I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, a quiet determination that hummed beneath my skin. I dressed carefully, choosing my best sweater and a scarf George had given me on our last anniversary. As I looked in the mirror, I caught a glimpse of the woman I used to be. Steady, hopeful, unafraid to take a chance. I arrived at Bistro Nouveau just after opening. The owner, David, greeted me with a tired but genuine smile. The restaurant was even quieter than before, the silence broken only by the distant clatter of pans in the kitchen. We sat at a small table by the window, sunlight pooling between us, and began to talk in earnest. David was honest about the challenges. "I opened this place with a dream," he confessed, his voice tinged with regret. "But dreams don't always pay the bills. I tried to keep up with trends: truffle oil, microgreens, molecular gastronomy. But it never felt like home. People came once for the novelty, but they didn't come back for comfort." I listened, nodding, my hands folded, in my lap. "I know what it's like to pour your heart into something and feel it go unnoticed," I said softly. "But I also know the power of a meal that feels like a memory. I think that's what people are really hungry for." He looked at me, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "What would you do if this place were yours?" I smiled, feeling the spark inside me catch fire. "I'd strip away the pretense, bring back the kind of food that makes people close their eyes and remember their grandmother's kitchen. I'd serve recipes that tell a story, my story, and theirs. I'd make this a place where everyone feels welcome, no matter who they are or what they're wearing." David leaned back, considering. "I think you could do it. I really do." We discussed numbers, the practicalities of the sale. I revealed my savings, money George and I had set aside for family vacations, for dreams we'd never quite managed to fulfill. It felt strange at first to use it for myself, but as I signed the papers, I realized this was a different kind of journey, a chance to reclaim not just my dignity, but my sense of self. The sale was discreet. We agreed I would remain anonymous for now, letting the restaurant's new identity speak for itself. David promised to help with the transition, introducing me to his suppliers and staff. He seemed almost relieved to let go, to pass the torch to someone who still believed in the magic of a shared meal. That afternoon, I sat alone in the empty dining room, sunlight slanting across the polished tables. I closed my eyes and imagined laughter echoing off the walls, the clink of glasses, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen. I could almost hear George's voice, urging me on. "Make it yours, Ruth. Make it matter." I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. The first thing I did was dig out my old recipe box, a battered tin decorated with faded roses, stuffed with index cards in my mother's looping script, and my own hurried notes. I spread them across the table, sorting through decades of family favorites: chicken and dumplings, apple pie, pot roast with root vegetables, cinnamon rolls, sticky with icing. Each card was a memory, a piece of my life I was ready to share with the world. I hired a small staff, people who understood the value of tradition, who believed that food was more than just sustenance. There was Maria, a single mother who made the best biscuits I'd ever tasted. Jamal, a young line cook with a knack for seasoning and a heart as big as his smile. And Evelyn, a retired school teacher who wanted to learn to bake bread from scratch. We became a team, united by a shared belief in the power of comfort food. We spent long days in the kitchen testing recipes, laughing over failed soufflés, celebrating every small victory. I taught Maria how to make my mother's chicken pot pie, showed Jamal the secret to perfect mashed potatoes, and let Evelyn knead bread dough until her hands were dusted with flour and her cheeks glowed with pride. The kitchen filled with the sounds of music and laughter, the air thick with the scents of roasting meat and baking bread. We changed the decor too, swapping out the cold, modern art for vintage photographs and hand-stitched quilts. I brought in mismatched china from my own collection, each plate a story in itself. We set fresh flowers on every table, lit candles at night, and played old jazz records that made the whole place feel like a warm embrace. Word began to spread. At first, it was just a trickle. Neighbors curious about the changes, old friends stopping by for a taste of nostalgia. But soon the dining room was full again, the tables crowded with families, couples, and solitary souls looking for a place to belong. People lingered over their meals, sharing stories and laughter, their faces glowing in the candlelight. I watched it all from the kitchen, my heart swelling with pride. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as someone's mother or grandmother, not as a cook to be dismissed, but as Ruth, the woman who had built something beautiful from the ashes of her own hurt. I kept my ownership a secret, letting the food and the atmosphere speak for themselves. I wanted people to come for the comfort, not the novelty, for the sense of home, not the hype. My staff respected the choice, protecting my privacy while sharing in the joy of our success. At night, after the last customer had left and the kitchen was quiet, I would sit at a corner table with a cup of tea, watching the world outside. The city lights sparkled, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I thought of George, of the family I'd loved and lost, of the wounds that had brought me here. I realized that in taking back this piece of my life, I had found something I thought I'd lost forever, my own worth. The restaurant became a haven, not just for me but for everyone who walked through its doors. It was a place of warmth and authenticity, a refuge from a world that too often valued the new over the true. And as I locked up each night, I knew I had done something remarkable. I had taken back my power, not through anger or revenge, but through love. Love for my craft, for my community, and finally, for myself. The first real sign that things were changing came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when a line began to form outside the restaurant's door. It started with a handful of neighbors, curious perhaps or simply hungry for something different. But as the weeks passed, the line grew longer, winding down the block, umbrellas bobbing in the drizzle as people waited for a taste of what was happening inside. Inside, the restaurant glowed with warmth and life. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and roasting chicken, the walls alive with laughter and conversation. Ruth moved through the kitchen with a grace she hadn't felt in years, her hands steady, her voice confident, as she called out orders and offered encouragement. To her small but loyal staff, the menu, once a parade of trendy, forgettable dishes, now read like a love letter to family and tradition. There was her mother's pot roast, slow-cooked until it fell apart at the touch of a fork, her late husband's favorite apple pie, the crust golden and flaky, rolls brushed with melted butter, just like she used to make for her children on special mornings. Every dish told a story, and every story was served with a side of comfort. It didn't take long for word to spread. Local food bloggers wrote glowing reviews, praising the authenticity and soul of the food. Families began to return week after week, bringing friends and out-of-town relatives. Even the mayor stopped by one evening, shaking Ruth's hand and declaring her chicken and dumplings the best he'd ever tasted. But the real transformation was happening not in the headlines or the crowded dining room, but within Ruth herself. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as someone's mother or grandmother, not as a background figure in her own story, but as the heart and soul of something wonderful. Every compliment, every empty plate, every satisfied sigh from a customer was a balm to the wounds left by years of feeling invisible. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counter after the lunch rush, Ruth overheard a conversation between two older women seated by the window. "I wish I could cook like this," one said wistfully. "My kids always say my food is too plain. They never ask for my recipes." Ruth felt a pang of recognition, a mirror of her own pain from Christmas. She approached their table, her smile gentle. "Would you like to learn?" she asked. "I'm thinking of starting some cooking classes, just for folks like us. We'll share recipes, stories, and maybe a few secrets." The women's faces lit up, and within days Ruth had a small group gathered in her kitchen, aprons tied and hands dusted with flour. They were teachers and nurses, widows and grandmothers, each carrying their own stories of being overlooked or dismissed. Together they chopped and stirred, kneaded and rolled, their laughter echoing through the restaurant like music. The classes became a weekly ritual. Ruth taught them her mother's pie crust technique, the secret to perfectly seasoned stew, the art of folding dough for tender biscuits. But more than that, she listened to stories of lost husbands and distant children, of holidays spent alone, of dreams deferred but never quite forgotten. The kitchen became a sanctuary, a place where age was celebrated and wisdom cherished. As the weeks turned to months, the community around the restaurant grew. Regulars brought friends, who brought more friends, until Ruth knew the names and stories of nearly everyone who walked through her door. She watched as strangers became friends, as laughter bridged the gaps left by years of loneliness. She saw herself reflected in the women she taught, strong, resilient, and worthy of being seen. Her staff, too, blossomed under her guidance. Maria, once shy and uncertain, now greeted customers with a bright smile and a plate of homemade cookies. Jamal, whose confidence had faltered after losing his first job, became the restaurant's unofficial soup king, his creations drawing praise from even the toughest critics. Evelyn, who had never baked bread before, now taught others, her hands sure and steady, as she shaped loaves for the oven. Ruth's confidence bloomed with each passing day. She no longer hesitated to share her ideas or to stand her ground when someone questioned her choices. She trusted her instincts, her palate, and her heart. The wounds left by Claire's cruel words began to heal, replaced by the steady, glowing warmth of self-worth. One evening, after a particularly busy dinner service, Ruth stood in the dining room as her staff cleaned up around her. She looked out at the tables, crumbs and empty glasses, the remnants of another night well spent, and felt a surge of gratitude. She had built something lasting, something meaningful, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a place to belong. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small group of her cooking students lingering by the door, their arms full of leftovers and their faces flushed with happiness. "Thank you, Ruth," one of them said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've given us more than recipes. You've given us hope." Ruth smiled, her eyes shining. "You've given me hope, too," she replied. "We're all in this together." That night, as she sat alone in the quiet kitchen, Ruth allowed herself to reflect on the journey she had taken. She thought of the Christmas table where she had felt so small, the kitchen where she had cried alone, the moment she had decided to take back her power. She realized that the restaurant was more than just a business. It was a testament to her resilience, a living legacy of love and courage. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. She felt at peace, content in a way she hadn't known in years. She knew there would be challenges ahead, slow nights, difficult customers, the ache of missing her family. But she also knew she was strong enough to face them for the first time in a long while. Ruth felt truly alive. She had rediscovered herself, not in the approval of others, but in the joy of sharing her gifts with the world. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, valued, and loved. Not just by others, but by herself. And as the night deepened and the city grew quiet, Ruth smiled to herself, knowing that her story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The first snow of December dusted the city in white, turning sidewalks into ribbons of frost and rooftops into gingerbread confections. Inside the restaurant, warmth radiated from every corner. Candles flickered. On tables adorned with holly sprigs, the air was alive with the scent of cinnamon, roasted meats, and fresh-baked bread. The staff moved with practiced ease, laughter, and the clatter of plates blending into a symphony of celebration. Ruth stood, in the kitchen, hands dusted with flour, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. It had been a year since her world had changed, since she'd claimed her own worth, one recipe at a time. Now the restaurant was fully booked for Christmas Eve, every table reserved weeks in advance. She was proud, yes, but tonight carried a different weight. Tonight her family was coming. She had overheard the news from Maria, who'd taken the reservation. "It's a party of 8, under the name Anderson," Maria had said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Special request for a table by the window." The daughter-in-law sounded particular. Ruth's breath had caught in her throat. Claire, her son, the grandchildren. They hadn't recognized Maria's voice, hadn't known whose hands would be shaping their meal. Ruth had kept her ownership secret, letting the food and the atmosphere speak for themselves. She'd wondered sometimes if her family had heard the rumors about the new restaurant with the old soul. But she never asked. Tonight she would find out. As the evening unfolded, Ruth busied herself in the kitchen, directing her staff, tasting sauces, adjusting the seasoning on the roast. She peeked through the pass as the Anderson party arrived, her heart stuttering at the sight of her son's familiar silhouette, the children's excited chatter, Claire's elegant coat and carefully styled hair. They were greeted by Maria, who led them to the best table in the house. Claire's voice carried, clear as a bell. "I've heard this place is impossible to get into. Everyone at my office raves about it. Supposedly, the chef is some kind of genius with comfort food. I can't wait to see if it lives up to the hype." Ruth smiled to herself, a mixture of nerves and pride swirling in her chest. She watched as menus were opened, as her grandchildren pressed their noses to the window, marveling at the snow. Claire ordered with confidence, requesting the restaurant's most popular dishes: pot roast, chicken and dumplings, apple pie. "Let's try everything," she declared. "I want to see what all the fuss is about." The kitchen sprang into action. Ruth's hands moved with purpose, each movement infused with memory and love. She ladled gravy over the pot roast, sprinkled cinnamon on the pie, arranged biscuits in a basket lined with a linen napkin. Her staff worked beside her, their camaraderie a quiet comfort. They knew the story, knew what this night meant. As the food was served, Ruth watched from the doorway, hot in her throat. She saw her family's faces light up with the first bites, saw her son close his eyes and smile, saw her grandchildren devour the rolls with sticky fingers. Even Claire, ever the critic, seemed genuinely delighted. "This is incredible," she murmured, reaching for another helping. "It tastes like, well, it tastes like Christmas." The table buzzed with conversation and laughter, the kind Ruth remembered from her happiest years. For a moment, she let herself simply watch, soaking in the sight of her family together, happy and whole. She felt a pang of longing, but it was softened by pride. They didn't know it yet, but they were tasting her story, her resilience, her love, her refusal to be diminished. Maria approached the kitchen, a soft smile on her lips. "They want to meet the chef," she said quietly. "They're raving about the food. Claire says it's the best meal she's ever had." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, nerves fluttering in her stomach. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out into the dining room. The room seemed to hush as she approached the table, the glow of the candles casting her in soft light. Her family looked up, confusion flickering across their faces. Her son's eyes widened in recognition. The grandchildren gasped, and Claire's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Mom?" her son whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Ruth smiled, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Merry Christmas, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your meal." Claire's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words. You're the chef? This is your restaurant?" Ruth nodded, her gaze gentle but unwavering. "Yes. I bought it last winter. I wanted to create a place that felt like home, where people could come together over food that means something." There was a stunned silence, broken only by the soft clink of a spoon against china. Ruth looked at Claire, her expression kind but resolute. "Thank you, Claire. You inspired me, in your own way. Sometimes it takes a little pain to remind us what we're capable of." Claire's eyes filled with tears, whether of shame, surprise, or something else. Ruth couldn't say. Her son stood, moving around the table to embrace her. "Mom, I had no idea. This is amazing. I'm so proud of you." The grandchildren crowded around, clamoring for hugs, their excitement undimmed by the revelation. Ruth laughed, the sound bright and free. She felt taller, lighter, as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been set down. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her dignity was in her presence, in the food she'd served, in the community she'd built. She saw the realizations dawn in Claire's eyes, not just of what Ruth had accomplished, but of the love and strength it had taken to get there. As the family settled back into their seats, Ruth lingered for a moment, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly. "This place, it's for all of us." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and stories, of second helpings and shared memories. Ruth returned to the kitchen, her heart overflowing. She watched her family through the window, saw the way they looked at her now, with respect, with awe, with love. When the night ended and the last guest had gone, Ruth stood in the empty dining room, the candles burning low. She breathed in the scents of cinnamon and roast, listened to the echoes of laughter, and felt at last that she was exactly where she belonged. Christmas had come full circle, and Ruth, standing tall in her apron, knew she had given her family, and herself, the greatest gift of all, the courage to be seen. The restaurant was quiet, the last echoes of laughter and clinking glasses lingering in the air as Ruth locked the front door. The glow of the holiday lights outside cast gentle patterns across the empty tables, each one a silent witness to the transformation that had taken place, not just within these walls, but within her own heart. She moved through the dining room, collecting stray napkins and wiping down surfaces, her steps unhurried, her spirit at peace. Earlier that evening, after the plates were cleared and the last crumbs of pie savored, her family had gathered around her. There were apologies, some tearful, some awkward, all sincere. Claire, her voice trembling, admitted how wrong she'd been, how much she'd underestimated the love and strength behind every meal Ruth had ever made. Her son embraced her, whispering words of pride and regret. The grandchildren clung to her, their eyes shining with newfound admiration. Ruth listened, her heart open but steady. She forgave them, truly, deeply, but she also spoke her truth. "I love you all, but I won't ever let myself be made small again. This is my home, my life, and I will fill it with love and pride, whether or not anyone else understands. There were nods, more hugs, and a sense of something old and heavy finally lifting from her shoulders. As the night wore on and the city outside settled into sleep, Ruth returned to her kitchen. She poured herself a cup of tea and cut a generous slice of her famous apple pie. The same recipe that had comforted her through loneliness, and now, through triumph. She sat at the little table in the corner, the one she'd reserved for herself, and took a bite. The flavors were familiar. Sweet apples, warm cinnamon, a flaky buttery crust. But tonight they tasted new, richer, deeper, layered with the hard-earned sweetness of self-respect. She savored every mouthful, letting the silence wrap around her like a soft blanket. In that quiet moment, Ruth realized she was no longer cooking for approval or validation. She was cooking for herself, for the joy of creation, for the love that had always been her greatest gift. The restaurant would continue to thrive, her recipes cherished by strangers and friends alike. But the truest victory was here, in the peace she felt at her own table, finally tasting the fullness of her own worth. With a contented sigh, she finished her pie, closed her eyes, and let gratitude settle in her bones. She was home, truly, finally, and forever home. If you loved listening this story, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. I know you all are so sweet, and you will definitely subscribe. Thanks for listening me. It means a lot to me.